Good afternoon. In a minute, Secretary Cohen will make a statement about the Tomb of the Unknowns, and after that, he'll take a few questions. We have a team of experts led by Rudy de Leon on the tomb to go into considerable detail on that issue. Secretary Cohen.
Will the Secretary start off with an Iraqi thing for us? That's really the breaking story now. Just a brief.
The Secretary will start out with a statement on the Tomb of the Unknowns, and if you have a question, he'll answer the question.
Less than 7 weeks ago, with profound reluctance, we disturbed the hallowed ground of the Tomb of the Unknowns in an effort to identify the Vietnam unknown and to ease the lingering anguish of one American family. We took that somber step only because of our abiding commitment to the fullest possible accounting for every warrior who has fought and died for our nation. After a successful mitochondrial DNA comparison and forensic examination, using the state-of-the-art technology that was not available back in 1984, the United States Army Central Identification Laboratory has determined that the remains interred in 1984 as the Vietnam unknown are those of U.S. Air Force First Lieutenant Michael Joseph Blassie. This morning, I conveyed that information to his mother, Mrs. George C. Blassie of Missouri. The report, which documents the work of the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, the U.S. Army Central Identification Laboratory, and the Defense Prisoner of War Missing Personnel Office, and the resulting identification, that is now being reviewed independently by 3 outside consultants with acknowledged expertise in forensic science. Those consultants are going to complete their work by tomorrow, and the report will then be conveyed to Mrs. Blassie for her review. And then afterwards, the report will be forwarded to the Armed Forces Identification Review Board for the final determination. Since the end of the war in Vietnam, the Department of Defense has identified the remains of 496 Americans. Some 2,087 Americans who died in that conflict remain unaccounted for. As we share with the Blassie family the knowledge that the remains of their loved one have been identified, I want to renew the pledge to those whose loved ones are still missing that the United States government and the Department of Defense are going to continue to search for each and every American warrior who has died in foreign lands defending our nation and whose remains have not yet been located and brought home. On behalf of the Department of Defense, I also want to especially express my appreciation to the other families whose selfless cooperation made the identification of the former Vietnam unknown possible. Thank you, and I'll now entertain your questions.
Would you be kind enough to defer just for a moment and tell us what you can about the situation in Iraq today?
Well, the situation is that at approximately 1:30 this morning, 4 British aircraft were continuing their no-fly zone operations in the southern part of Iraq, during which time they were tracked by Iraqi radar. And as a result of that tracking, a HARM missile was fired by a U.S. F-16 aircraft at the site, at the site of the radiation. Beyond that, I don't have any information that would add to what you already know in terms of the consequences of the firing of that missile. At this point, we cannot determine with any certainty whether the missile hit any radar or whether it missed.
Do you see this as
one follow-up? Is this a rogue act, do you think, or is this?
Well, we don't know. It could be simply an isolated example. We have not seen any evidence on the part of the Iraqis altering their air defense system. We have not seen any examples of higher alert. We have not seen them moving their radars and tracking systems around in any sort of aggressive fashion. So it might be a situation of an isolated example.
Mr. Secretary, the British fighters were the first to recognize that the radar was activated. Why was it up to the U.S. then to fire on them? Why didn't the British fighters or a British long-range missile team?
The U.S. aircraft in the area was armed with the HARM missile, which was deemed to be the most effective weapon to target that radar set at that time. It was a split-second type of operation. We have a lock-on of the radar for only seconds at a time, and so this decision was made on that kind of a split-second decision-making status.
How
That the U.S. has drawn down to nearly half the force it had a month and a half ago, is this going to alter any of your plans on keeping it, or are you going to just watch and wait and keep your force level
No,
steady?
this will not alter our plans. I don't think that we should draw any conclusions from this particular one incident. Obviously, if the situation changes, then we would change our plans. But right now, we have more than adequate capability to deter any attack upon U.S. forces or allied forces, and more than sufficient capability of inflicting substantial harm. So we see no need at this point to change anything.
Mr. Secretary, what message should this send to Iraq Saddam Hussein?
The message is a very simple one, that our forces are going to protect themselves. This is an act of self-defense. We believe very strongly that our aircraft and those of our friends are going to fly without being attacked or the threat of attack. And should that threat manifest itself, it will be responded to immediately. Beyond that, I think that's the single message we want to send.
Iraq has denied targeting the U.S. planes and labeled this an act of aggression. Your reaction?
Well, you have 4 British aircraft that identified their aircraft as being illuminated, or the one aircraft being illuminated, but it was confirmed by 3 other British aircraft, plus the US F-16. There is no need for the United States or the British or the French, should that be the case in the future, to try to either create a situation of aggression or conflict. They are simply engaging in their own self-protection, and they will continue to do that. We hope that this will be seen as an isolated example and not see any escalation on the part of the Iraqis.
To move to the subject, Kosovo.
I think we have a fellow.
Oh, we have, okay.
Yeah.
We'll take one more question, then we'll move back to the Tomb of the Unknowns. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought somebody was going to go ahead of me. Kosovo is looking pretty bleak at the present. Mr. Holbrook concludes that it's only a few steps from full war. Mr. Berger, come on, guys. Mr. Berger says that NATO is ready to intervene. What is your assessment?
Well, NATO is in the process of examining a full range of military options, and those options that are being examined are quite significant in scope and size and capability, but there has been no decision, to my knowledge, in terms of any finality of any particular military option. In addition, of course, there's the question that remains as to whether or not NATO feels, or the members of NATO feel, that must secure UN Security Council authorization or a mandate. You know, the United States, of course, takes a different position, that we feel that there is more than enough authority for NATO to act on its own to deal with this situation, should it require any kind of a military operation.
Mr. Secretary?
Secretary, what's the next step now with the tomb? What happens? Are there other unidentified remains that might go there, or are there no more missing, soldiers from Vietnam War?
Well, it's something that we are going to consult with members of Congress, the veterans organizations, and other authorities to determine what takes place now. It may be that forensic science has reached the point where there will be no other unknowns in any war. So we have to look very carefully at where we go from here, but right now we're trying to bring this to completion. Again, I talked to Mrs. Blassie this morning, and she and her family members are hoping to see a conclusion of this with a burial sometime in the very near future.
Secretary,
As a matter of procedure, you most likely will now go to all of the unidentified remains and try to do this same procedure on all of them, will you not?
That remains to be determined, John. We are going to consult with, again, key members of Congress, with the various committees, with also the veterans organizations, in terms of how we proceed from this point with other unknowns.
And there's already two.
Apparently one of the families was notified yesterday or the day before this morning. You know, after all this time, where the Blassies perhaps felt they had been mistreated before, why did they have to hear about this on TV and read about it in the newspaper?
I believe that the Blassie family, in fact, was notified yesterday by certain individuals. I waited until I returned to Washington to officially notify them, but I talked with the family today. They were quite happy, frankly, with the way in which it's been handled. They're very praiseworthy of Rudy de Leon, who has really been deeply involved in helping to bring this to a conclusion, and they seem quite satisfied with the process.
Secretary Cohen, President Reagan awarded the Medal of Honor to the unknown soldier. What happens? Does Michael Blassie get to keep that or take it back or what?
Well, the Blassie, Mr. Blassie was awarded the Silver Star posthumously to reflect his bravery in the course of his duties. The medal itself was presented and awarded to the unknowns of Vietnam as a symbol of those missing in action and unaccounted for. I believe this issue has to be examined for all of the legal implications of it, and that's something that the Air Force will undertake to do. But my understanding was that the medal was awarded for the benefit of all of those who remained unknown. But that's an issue that has to be subjected to some legal analysis right now, and the Air Force is going to undertake that.
Secretary, the tomb contains remains from World War I, World War II, and Korea War, and no longer Vietnam. Will there be a replacement of remains?
I don't know. I mean, that's something we have to examine now and find out what steps will take place. Mr. De Leon is here to try to give you a further examination on it.
Question on Iraq again.
Sure.
If this wasn't a hostile action by Iraq, as you say it might not have been, what could it have been?
No, I didn't say it wasn't a hostile action. The question is whether it was an isolated one, whether it was an effort to deliberately target this either on the part of the operator on his own, or whether or not it was something that was mandated and commanded to do, whether it's simply an isolated example. We don't know the answer to that. I think it would not behoove us to speculate what the motivation may have been. We will watch very carefully. We will continue to fly the no-fly zone. We will continue to engage in force protection, self-protection, and to do what is ever necessary to protect our pilots. But I don't know that we're in a position to speculate as to what the motivation may have been. I think that we will see what the consequences are as far as the Iraqi reaction. Hopefully we will return to the same basis that we have been engaged in for the past several months now. They have made no aggressive moves that we have detected, at least, toward any of our aircraft, and so it may be an isolated case.
As a result, are U.S. or Allied pilots in Operation Southern Watch on any higher state of alert? Have they changed their procedures at all as a result of this incident?
They are always on a fairly high state of alert in terms of making sure that they are protected. They will perhaps be a little more acute in terms of their actions right now, but we would maintain the same level of protection.
Given that U.S. planes have control of the skies, what is the delay in the battle damage assessment?
I can't answer that question in terms of whether the assessment has been completed yet, in terms of all of the imagery information coming down and being analyzed. I don't know that the target was hit. It seems it perhaps was not hit, but I don't have that information that would confirm that.
You ran into the fact that President Clinton wasn't notified of this incident until some 8 hours after the fact.
Well, in view of the fact that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and other officials were notified, it was determined apparently that it was not necessary to interrupt the proceedings in China right now. If it had been more serious, then obviously this information would have been communicated right away. But a determination was made that it was isolated in nature, and it was left at that.
You said there's a possibility that the missile did not hit, a possibility it did not hit the radar, but do you have to hit each radar in order to effectively prevent Saddam Hussein from threatening U.S. planes?
The answer is no. I think you can send a signal that we intend to engage very vigorously in force protection, that if any of our aircraft or those of our allies are targeted, then they will be met with a very vigorous response. I think that signal was sent, and hopefully it will rest there. Hopefully it was just simply an isolated example and not a concerted effort on the part of Saddam or any of his troops to put our forces in jeopardy. Should they be put in jeopardy, then obviously that would call for a very, very vigorous response on our part.
Mr. Secretary, with regard to the North Korean sub that was captured by the South and the discovery of, I think, 9 dead crewmen aboard, do you see that having any adverse impact on the North-South dialogue at this point?
Not at this time. In fact, I met with General Talleli this morning. The Sinks are in Washington having their annual conference, and the military-to-military contacts are still ongoing, so it has not interrupted that effort right now.
Back to the tomb, you say the Blassies were pleased by the news when you talked to them this morning. Is there any concern that perhaps the Blassies or the other families involved will cause any unnecessary anguish by the length of time it took to make this identification, and what can you do to prevent this from happening again?
Well, I'm sure that they suffered anguish from the day that, that Mrs. Blassie's son was lost. Obviously, anyone who has lost a family member would go through a long period of anguish, and that anguish will probably never be extinguished. But this does bring a measure of completion to the search for their son. And how can we prevent it in the future? I think by virtue of the advances in science, that we will no longer have to have that kind of a delay in the future. So I think that they are satisfied with the action that we have taken. They far would have preferred to have taken the action much sooner. Science was not at the state where it could have performed the kind of examination with the kind of certainty that is involved here prior to this time.
Secretary, some of the POW and MIA groups have accused the Pentagon of rushing to identify remains with very little forensic evidence, that the whole operation at Silhai in Hawaii is flawed and needs to be investigated, and that this is just a perfect example of problems there. Are you concerned about that, lab? Is there going to be an investigation, given the fact that you now know that this was not an unknown?
I think I'll leave that question to Mr. de Leon in terms of the competence or capability of the lab. I have been advised that the kind of examination that has been conducted, I indicated it would take between 30 and 45 days. We're at that precise time right now from the time that we began, and there is a 99.9% degree of certainty that these remains are those of
I mean, going back to the early 80s, when these remains were believed to be Michael Blassie, and then they were made to be X-26 back then, and up to the present with other remains.
Well, there was a senior working group that has examined this particular case and found that there was no evidence to support any attempt on the part of the Pentagon or the Defense Department to in any way manipulate this. The evidence simply wasn't there to confirm that this was First Lieutenant Blassie's remains. Beyond that, I think perhaps Mr. de Leon can comment more extensively on the assessment of the process.
Mr. Secretary, the Inspector General has now handed your office a report on General Hale. Has your office found any malfeasance, any responsibility on the Chief of Staff of the Army for the way General Hale's retirement was handled?
Well, since the investigation is still underway, and that report has then now been sent to the Army for its comment and reaction, I really can't comment on it at this point.
It's your office that will determine whether or not the Chief of Staff of the Army has acted properly.
Ultimately, I will have, yes, a very major role to play on this, which is the reason I can't comment.
Are you convinced that the analysis of the Iraqi warheads, the finding of VX is correct? Are you convinced that they had it, and loaded it, and then disposed of it?
I really don't have that kind of information that I could make a statement. I believe there has been a pattern of deception and lying on the part of the Iraqis from the very beginning. They originally indicated they had no VX, had no anthrax. All of that, of course, has been proven to be incorrect. They also stated categorically that they had not weaponized their missiles. The evidence that has been presented by Mr. Butler and the UNSCOM inspectors would appear to contradict that. The judgment as to whether or not that evidence is persuasive remains with the United Nations for the moment. But I think you have to go back and look at the pattern of behavior on the part of the Iraqis and then make a calculation or a judgment in terms of whether or not this would appear to be very accurate information.
Therefore, no sanctions relief.
I believe until such time, I've stated this time and time again, until such time as the Iraqis fully comply with the UN Security Council resolutions. And that means not only is the burden upon the UNSCOM inspectors to search throughout Iraq, a country the size of the state of Wyoming, looking for evidence and fragments of chemical and biological agents or weapons. The burden is also fully upon Saddam Hussein to produce evidence that he has in fact done what he claims he has done, namely destroyed all of the VX and the anthrax, excuse me, and the missiles that have been banned by the Security Council resolutions. So he has an affirmative obligation not to prove a negative, but to prove a positive. Until such time as that takes place, there should be no consideration of lifting of the sanctions.
Mr. Secretary, considering technology today, is it safe to say that we're not going to be burying any more unknown soldiers?
I think that's safe to say that could be proven wrong, but it would seem to me that given the state of the art today, it's unlikely that we'll have future unknowns.
Rudy de Leon and his team are here to take more.
I'm Rudy de Leon. I'm the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. I and others will be answering any follow-up questions that you might have. First, as the Secretary did, I'd like to thank the families that participated. This opened up chapters in some of their lives, but it brought closure, and we are grateful to them. In addition, I'd like to thank some of the people that have been working on my team on this issue for the last several months. It's been a rather comprehensive process, but Doug Dworkin of the Office of Secretary of Defense General Counsel, Bill Coleman, the Army GC, Alan Liotta, who will be up here with me in a second answering questions, Fred Rollrath, Lieutenant General, United States Army for Personnel, Dave Vesely, the Assistant Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, Jack Metzler, the Superintendent of Arlington National Cemetery, Lieutenant Colonel Sharon Dunbar of my office, Fred Smith of OSD Policy, Jan Lodel, the Principal Deputy in OSD Policy, and Charlie Cragin, my own Principal Deputy. I'd like to thank them for their help and assistance in working together really on a project that had no precedent. Joining me today to answer your questions are Charlie Cragin, Alan Liotta, the Deputy Director of the Defense Prisoner of War Missing Personnel Office, the Assistant Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Lieutenant General Dave Vesely, and Ed Huffine, the Chief of the Mitochondrial DNA section of the Armed Forces DNA Identification Lab. I'd also like to thank retired Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Webb of the SIL-High Lab for his assistance as our task force has worked and met. So having gone through that introduction, we're happy to answer any questions that you might have, please.
Can you explain without getting a little bit technical of the original forensic anthropology report showed that there was a different blood type, different height, different age, and seemed to point to Strobridge. Can you explain that? And can you also tell us how, percentage-wise, how sure you are that there's a match between Gene Blassie and the remains?
As I briefed a number of you some time ago, when the SIL-High made its initial assessments, it made the determinations based upon some anthropological studies and a blood typing, as well as an evaluation of personal effects that were turned over to American military personnel in An Loc by Vietnamese militia. The anthropological studies indicated that the stature of the individual, based essentially on the size of a portion of a pelvic bone and a right humerus, matched with the anthropological stature of Captain Rodney Strobridge, and did not, in fact, have a specific match with Captain Blassie. There were some leg hairs found in the right leg of a portion of the flight suit that was delivered as part of the personal effects. Those leg hairs were subjected to blood typing, and the blood type indicated an O blood type, whereas Captain Strobridge was an O type and Lieutenant Blassie was an A type. So we had the anthropological and blood typing studies at the time going in one direction. At the same time, we had the personal effects that were brought in with the remains, indicating in the other direction, because there was a single life raft, which would be consistent with Lieutenant Blassie's aircraft and would not be consistent with a Cobra helicopter, Captain Strobridge's aircraft, or a C-130 that had also gone in the Anlock area between May and October. So really, the evidence at that point was in equipoise, and you couldn't reach a conclusion one way or the other, and it was for that reason that we had to wait for the technology to arrive with mtDNA.
Does that mean that those remains probably don't have a type O blood, or I mean that those tests were wrong?
We now know, keep in mind that when you first evaluate the evidence, you look at it as of the time that it occurred, and not with the great beauty of retrospection. We now know that those types of blood typing studies are only about 67% reliable, even under the best of laboratory conditions. And we certainly know that these were not laboratory conditions under which the leg hairs, the body hairs were found. We also don't know, because of a lack of any chain of evidence, as to really whose body hairs they were. But we do know now that those tests were not as reliable as were presumed at the time.
How sure, percentage-wise, are you that this is Michael Blassie?
The scientists tell us, and Mr. Huffine is here and can speak on behalf of AFDIL, but they tell us that they are 99.9% sure, based on the perfection of the match of the sequences between the mtDNA extracted from the bone samples and the mtDNA samples provided by Mrs. Blassie and Michael Blassie's sister, Patricia, that they have a specific match. At the same time, they were also able, based on the samples provided by the other families, to exclude those samples. So we have both a specific match for Blassie as well as an exclusion of the other families. Ed, you want to comment?
As was just stated, one of the strongest aspects of mitochondrial DNA is its ability to exclude people when you have a very narrow population of individuals. That's something that CellHi did for us. They went out, they investigated what potential families these remains could belong to. Then they went out and they gathered family references for those particular families they thought would be able to account for those remains. Not only did it match this one family, all the others that we tested were excluded. So that's some of the power of mitochondrial DNA.
As we understand it, this technique can work. As you say, we have a very small universe of possible persons. Now, how would it work when you, on the 2,000 remaining unknowns, where you have a much larger universe? Is it something in your judgment that would work?
Well, for the Southeast Asia cases, there's generally a lot of other circumstantial evidence. They generally know the place of the loss. They might know the time of the loss. So even in those, if you have 2,000 sets of remains, those that are returned generally are defined to only be a few potential individuals. So once again, if it's either person A, B, or C, we can generally rule out 2 of the 3 individuals, and it will match the 3rd.
How many remains are there at CellHi now that could possibly be an unknown if you were going to keep?
You want to take that one?
From the Vietnam era, there are more than 100 sets of remains or portions of sets of remains that are currently undergoing forensic identification techniques. And then there are also several hundred for Korea.
Is it likely that you are now going to track each of these using the DNA technology that you developed and worked on here?
The laboratory currently, as part of its standard procedures, when it believes that DNA can help us as a tool in the forensic identification process, will take a sample and provide it to AFDIL and ask them to see if they can get a sequence from it, yes.
For the specific sets of remains that had been considered as candidates for the Tomb of the Unknown, are you now going back into those specific cases and trying to make matches of those?
Are you referring to the initial cases that were first in 1984 that referred? No, they have not gone back. Because in several cases, we've gotten additional information which would lead us to a process that would possibly exclude them from being meeting all the criteria that would be necessary. So, again, as the Secretary said, we have not crossed that bridge as to where we're going to go next. If a decision is made to do that, all the various cases will be looked in the appropriate means.
What is, Rudy, what is the difficulty in saying, yeah, we want to take this as far as we can? Is it money? Is it politics? Is it, where is the barrier to saying, yes, we want to go ahead with trying to identify as many of these as we can?
Well, you know, I think the protocol now is such, as the Secretary said, using the science, that we may not reach the point where we're going to truly hit a dead end. In trying to reconstruct the decision-making process back in 1984, the people at the time truly felt they had reached a dead end, that they could go no further in a legal sense. With the DNA science, you're dealing with a situation where you may well have a DNA signature on file that hypothetically could be matched against a family later in time. And so, you know, as the Secretary said, we would not rule out categorically that there might be another Vietnam unknown at this time. But the process that we have undergoing is one that is really not designed to deal with sort of dead ends, because of the science does give us additional approaches. Has that been a fair statement?
Would you have a sense of when you'll determine, you know, what the future of the tomb is, whether there'll be a soldier in there or not? I mean, how long that will take? Are we talking months or years or what?
You know, I think we have a number of consultations that have to occur. Recall that the entombment was authorized by act of Congress. So we would need to speak with the appropriate committees of jurisdiction in the Congress. Second, we would want to speak with the veterans organizations, as well as organizations that are associated with the accounting and identification of our missing in action, and then really also talk to the scientists and find out truly, not simply are there remains that are unidentified at this point, but whether there is truly something that is unidentifiable, so that the known but to God will really be the absolute standard. Help me if you think I've left anything out, but you know, this is you know, the scientists you know, really have their methodology as their integrity, and that's been one of the more interesting aspects of working on this project, is to first be assured of the competence of the individuals that are really working in these labs. Second, to see firsthand their personal dedication to a full accounting. So, you know, there are so many tools that modern science has opened. That, in combination with our country's commitment to fully account for all of our missing military personnel, you know, I think those two things have changed the...
How many missing are there now? What are we talking about?
From Vietnam, there's 2,087, and from the Vietnam conflict, that breaks down to 1,556 from Vietnam, 446 from Laos, 76 from Cambodia, and 8 from China.
Speaking of 100 sets of remains, that's the university you're working with at this point?
Well, that's what's been recovered, repatriated back to the laboratory and still undergoing identification.
Other
Other than the 8 families who provided samples in this case, are you getting samples from other families of unknowns just because maternal bloodlines may, end?
Just to correct the record, we had ultimately 7 families that provided samples, including Mrs. Strobridge as well as the Blassie family.
What about my question? Thank you.
Yes, family members from the Vietnam and the Korean conflict routinely send reference samples and can send reference samples to the DNA repository. They can receive a kit through their respective casualty office and put it on file. We are seeking to build that repository as large as we can because it helps validate the science as we do that.
So they can initiate it themselves?
Yes, they can.
You just need to get the word out that they should do that.
Correct.
First here and then second back there.
It's possible then to apply these techniques to remains of Korean War and possibly as well World War II missing in action? And could this not open up the possibility of the World War II unknown becoming known at some point? Is that also possible?
It is possible. Just to update you a little bit on the type of cases that we're actually doing. Not only are we successfully completing Southeast Asia cases, we are also successfully completing Korea-era losses. And we've now gone back to World War II in a few isolated incidents and are able to do successful DNA matches on those remains also.
Yeah, but you've got, when you're going back to World War II, you've got you know where these guys were. And you can say there were 12 guys who went down in a B-17, and then you can match it that way. The one who's in the tomb right now could be from Europe or from the Pacific or anywhere. I mean, you're not going to be able to make that one that smaller.
And you're absolutely right on point that this is a process that generally is an excluder, and therefore you need the other forensic evidence, circumstantial, anthropological, etc., before you can utilize this part of the process. So you're right on target on your assessment, sir.
Do you foresee or...
Sorry, I indicated I'd call on this man next and then...
Actually, the question was along those lines.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you foresee any circumstance in the future where you would disturb the tomb again, perhaps for the Korean remains?
I do not.
Can you say,
Steve?
Can you say how many identifications you've made in addition to this one using this technology?
This will be a ballpark figure because I have not reviewed the final number of DNA match reports that we have generated. But I believe it's somewhere in the 70 to 90 range currently. I believe it's approximately 70 to 90.
And also to follow up, I assume the DNA test was the clincher here, but was there other forensic evidence that you uncovered in the last month or so that pointed toward the Blassie identification?
A couple of things, Steve. First, we started with just an incredible database on Lieutenant Blassie. Those who were there when the remains were received in October 1972 followed a series of processes that we can all be proud of. I mean, the remains were logged in. There was an Army captain who recorded the fact that with these remains, in addition to the pieces of flight suit and other items consistent with an Air Force fighter, his identification card was there. That was logged in. Other identification was logged in. So we started with a series of pieces of information, and that really led to the original designation that the remains were believed to be Michael Blassie. In talking with the lab officials, the forensics were inconclusive. That is to say, they could not directly associate the forensic data at the time with Blassie, and that therefore the lawyers could not make an absolute determination on the identity. It was as much a legal issue as it was a substantive one at the time. The DNA is the additional piece that they didn't have that we do have. I think from what I'm led to believe, the match was quite a vivid match. I don't know if there's anything you want to elaborate on that. But so, when you look at the circumstantial evidence, the ID card being recovered, the equipment being recovered, with these remains being associated with an Air Force aircraft, not a C-130. In addition to the DNA, I think this is what lends us to have that 99% confidence. But Ed, anything additional you want to say? Okay.
Going back to that original recovery, you didn't have a very good chain of custody linking the personal effects to, you knew he crashed, but you didn't know 4 months had passed. You didn't know just because you get a life raft that it's the life raft that goes with those remains.
No, right. You can accept that as circumstantial, but you can't make the legal connection.
So if I understand it correctly, you really had no good forensic evidence at the time, or maybe even now when you went back and did the anthropological studies again that pointed to Blassie, or did you? Any conclusive evidence?
But because you get into
we start talking about the word evidence. There was clearly evidence, but as I said earlier, it became in equipoise.
Some are the circumstantial. I understand that was pointing towards Blassie, but I'm talking about the anthropological evidence. Did you have any of that, or did you learn any, as he asked, before you did the mitochondrial DNA?
As part of this process, once the remains were removed from the tomb, anthropologists reviewed all of those remains again. They would conclude, and I think the report will indicate, that anthropologically, based on the stature, and keep in mind that this is not an exact science, as we all understand, they were minimally consistent with Lieutenant Blassie, minimally consistent. And I think, given the addition of the additional evidence of the mtDNA, that gives you the ability to reach the conclusion. Absent that, I think it would be fair to say we would be right back where we were in that earlier period prior to mtDNA.
Now, you said that, or Secretary Cohen said tomorrow, 3 outside consultants are looking at the report now and expect to report tomorrow, and then it goes to Mrs. Blassie for her to look at and to give an okay, or?
This is the standard procedure that is utilized with respect to the identification of any remains. That essentially, AFDIL, if AFDIL does an mtDNA test as part of it, will then provide its results to SILHI. SILHI takes that forensic information, combines it with all of the other information with respect to the case, makes its conclusions. Once it has reached a conclusion that an identification should be recommended, it then sends its recommendation to 3 independent consultants, asks them to concurrently but separately review its recommendation, provide their response and report back to SILHI. SILHI will then consider those recommendations as part of its package, and then if they still have concurrence, and if they don't, obviously they'll move toward resolution, but assuming concurrence, SILHI will then transmit that entire package with the identification recommendation to the Mortuary Affairs Organization, so-called CMOC, which then will turn over the case file to the military department from which the person who is now being recommended for identification comes from, in this case, the Air Force. At that point, the Air Force, and in this case, Lieutenant General Vesely, will take that case file to the family and say that we are now in a position where SILHI is recommending that these remains be identified as your son. And we want to provide you with an opportunity to review the entire case file and to share with us your comments, observations. And generally speaking, families are provided about 30 days, but as you can well imagine, that's not a hard and fast rule. At the conclusion of the input from the family, that package will then be provided to the Armed Forces Identification Review Board. And that is the legal entity which then convenes a panel of officers which reviews the entire file And that panel is the official organization that makes the legal identification.
So what are we talking about, the time frame? You're assuming that it all goes.
Well, to some extent, as I indicated, it's dependent on how fast the Blassie family wants to review the case file. We're in the process of, as indicated, getting the input from the 3 independent consultants, and we expect to have that in within the week. Well, that would be within the week. When that comes in, it'll be compiled, and then that process that I've just articulated to you will take place.
You described the match as a vivid one. Could you explain more specifically where you took the samples from the now identified Blassie remains and where you got the sample from the mother and what made the match so vivid?
The way we normally process a case, or when bone fragments come in, we'll extract the DNA, the mitochondrial DNA from those, and basically type it. We received, I believe for this particular case, 6 bone fragments, obtained a mitochondrial DNA sequence. Then we got blood references from 2 maternal relatives of Blassie. We sequenced those blood references into comparison, and in all 610 bases that were reported for the mitochondrial DNA from the bones, there was the same sequence observed for the references. And compared to our database, that was a sequence that had never been seen before. So it is a relatively uncommon sequence.
Some of the families among the 2,000 still listed as missing for a variety of reasons, some of them being embitterment with the process, have declined to provide blood samples. How does that complicate your work in trying to complete identification?
It depends on the uniqueness of the case. If we need DNA as a tool to help us make the identification and we're unable to get a reference sample, then we can't use the technology that would be available to us. What we have found is because it's a relatively new science and it's being used increasingly, we have made a greater outreach effort to try and talk to families and explain the process. AFDL as a laboratory has been made open to the family members so that they can travel there and answer questions in an effort to try and educate. And this process itself, with the large work that a lot of you did for us, put out a lot of good words on the science itself, explaining it, and helped educate a great many people. And we saw some increase in reference samples coming in as a result of the higher education process that went on.
How many samples do you have now from families? Any ballpark?
I don't know if the lab...
2.3 million samples are in on
I don't
DNA.
mean that from the families still listed as missing. How many of them complied, or how many?
From Southeast Asia, I don't have an exact number, but I can tell you that the lab reports that on average they're getting about 10 or 15 reference samples a week that's coming in. And I don't know if those are all Southeast Asia. Some of those may well be Korea as well.
Does the Pentagon have any plans what preparations will be made to return the remains, and in terms of the funeral, will you be involved in that?
We have been in touch with the family. Once the process that was just described with you is completed, we will then work with the family, have the remains transported to the St. Louis area, and we will be involved with the memorial service, and he will be buried with full military honors.
So you've got to have the mother in order to make the positive ID, and you can't take any lineage from that mother.
It has to be a maternal relative. So it can be anyone who's related to that individual only through the female line. So you potentially could have dozens of potential donors. It could be a male donor, but his children, if he's related maternally, for instance, the mother's brother could also donate, but his children could not donate. The mother's sister could donate, and her children could also donate. So it can go through women to the next generation. It can go to a man, but it can't be passed from that man to the next, to his offspring.
So you can go on down then to younger females in the lineage.
Yes, it could be, as long as it's maternal, it could be a cousin, as long as it's maternally related.
You could do World War II.
Potentially.
At this point, we haven't yet made a match, a DNA match with the World War II set of remains.
We have Yes, we have made a DNA match.
These remains were in the field, I believe it was 4 months. So if remains are found now of someone who is missing from Southeast Asia, is it unlikely that you'll be able to come up with the DNA material if the remains have been out in the field for 20-some years?
It's definitely not unlikely. The longer they're in the field, especially in a place that's detrimental to DNA, for instance, very warm, very humid, DNA tends to degrade faster there. The longer they're in the field, the less likely it becomes to obtain DNA, but recent recoveries were able to extract DNA from those remains and send out reports on the DNA.
From Southeast Asia?
From Southeast Asia.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.